My name is Margaret Hale. I am 43 years old. On Christmas Eve, my husband, Daniel Hale, the CEO of Hale Biotech, looked at me across our dining table and said very calmly, "Say sorry to my new girlfriend or lose your paycheck and your promotion." I did not raise my voice. I did not ask him to repeat it. I did not cry. I said one word: "Okay." If you are here for loud revenge, you will be disappointed. This is not that kind of story. This is the kind that happens quietly behind boardroom doors, inside legal folders, and in the spaces where women are taught to stay grateful. Before we go any further, take a moment. If stories about emotional family betrayal, quiet justice, and women reclaiming their worth speak to you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Now let me tell you what that okay really meant. By the next morning, my bags were packed, not dramatically, not in a rush. 2 suitcases, 1 carry-on. My London transfer papers were finalized before sunrise. Daniel was still asleep when I zipped the last bag. At 7:45 a.m., his father, Richard Hale, called me. His voice was not angry. It was afraid. "Please tell me you did not send those papers," he said. I could hear it then. The sound of something fragile cracking, not loudly, but completely. "What papers?" Daniel asked later that morning, standing in the doorway of our kitchen with a smile that had powered shareholder meetings and crushed competitors for decades. That smile disappeared instantly. But let me take you back to Christmas Eve, because nothing that morning made sense unless you understood the night before. I was still wearing my work clothes when Daniel said it. The house was decorated, subtle lights, white candles, the kind of Christmas that looks calm from the outside. Sienna Brooks was sitting 2 seats away from him. I am 29 years old, innovation-led. She had the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the room wants to be impressed. Daniel did not call her his girlfriend. He did not need to. The way he looked at her did that for him. "She feels disrespected," he said, folding his napkin. "You embarrassed her at the board reception." I had asked one question that night. One. I had asked how her pilot project bypassed legal review. Apparently, that made me hostile. "You will apologize," Daniel continued, "or you will lose your paycheck and the promotion Richard approved last quarter." There it was. Not a marriage conversation. A corporate ultimatum. I remember noticing how quiet the room felt. No music, no clinking glasses, just power being exercised without shame. I looked at Sienna. She would not meet my eyes. I looked at my husband, the man I had built a life around, the man whose first investor pitch I had edited line by line, the man who had once told me, "You see what I miss?" And I said, "Okay." That was it. No speech, no warning. If you are wondering why I did not fight, you are asking the wrong question. I did fight, just not where he could see it. Because women like me learn something early. If you react in the moment, you lose control of the narrative. That night, while Daniel slept, I opened a folder I had not touched in years. Employment agreements, internal compliance reports, correspondence marked confidential. I did not print anything. I did not forward emails. I sent exactly what needed to be sent, to exactly the right places. By morning, the London transfer was no longer a threat. It was an exit. When Daniel finally realized I was leaving, he assumed it was temporary, a cooling-off period, a punishment that would bring me back quieter. That was his mistake. At the airport, as I watched the gate agent scan my boarding pass, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not anger, not relief, clarity. Because when a man tells you to apologize or be erased, he's revealing how he sees your value. And when you say okay, he assumes you agree. What he never considers is that some women do not say okay to comply. We say it to begin. He thought okay meant surrender. In truth, that was the moment I started. Not because I was restless, but because sleep felt unnecessary. My body was calm in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost clinical. I lay on my side in the bedroom we had shared for 20 years and listened to Daniel's breathing from the other side of the bed. It was steady, undisturbed. The sound of someone who believed the world would continue to arrange itself around him by morning. I did not turn toward him. I got up quietly and closed the bedroom door behind me, not out of anger, but out of instinct. Some doors close before we consciously decide to shut them. The room felt colder without him, not physically, but emotionally, as if something essential had been removed, leaving only space behind. I stood there for a long time, barefoot on the rug, looking at the faint outline our lives had worn into the furniture. His suits hung neatly pressed. My side of the closet was smaller. It always has been. I went into the bathroom and turned on the light. My reflection looked the same. No red eyes, no trembling hands. That was what unsettled me most. I did not cry. I did not panic. I felt nothing. That kind of emptiness is dangerous. It does not ask for comfort. It asks for clarity. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and did what I had done every morning for 2 decades. I filled the kettle. I waited for it to heat. I reached for my cup. It was a porcelain teacup with a thin crack running along the side. I had noticed the crack years ago, a hairline fracture that never quite broke through. Daniel once suggested replacing it. I never did. That cup had been with me through early mornings when the children were sick, through investor calls that ran past midnight, through quiet weekends when I wondered if I still existed outside the role I played. It fit my hands perfectly. I knew exactly how hot it could get before it burned me. I poured the water carefully and sat at the table. The tea steamed gently. The cup did not shatter. It never did. It simply held despite the damage. I wrapped my hands around it and felt the heat seep in. That was when the question finally surfaced, not as panic, but as something colder and sharper. If I apologize, will this family still be mine? Not the house, not the title. The family. Because what Daniel asked for was not a social courtesy. It was a submission disguised as peace. An apology would not restore harmony. It would rewrite the hierarchy. I thought of the years I had spent smoothing conflicts quietly, making myself smaller so things could function. I had called it love. I had called it a compromise. Now I saw it more clearly. Silence without strategy is not loyalty. It is disappearing. I carried the cup to the sink and rinsed it, watching the water trace the crack again and again. Still holding, still functional, but one impact away from breaking completely. Upstairs, Daniel shifted in bed. I could hear it through the floor. For a moment, I imagined walking back into the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the mattress, and saying what he wanted to hear. I imagined how quickly the tension would dissolve, how easily things would return to their familiar shape. That image felt heavier than any consequence I could foresee. I returned the cup to its place on the shelf. I did not throw it away. I did not cradle it either. I simply set it down, exactly where it had always been. My phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Daniel, already written, already waiting. I did not open it. I did not need to. Silence can be a language if you are fluent enough to use it. I picked up the phone, stared at the screen, and placed it face down. I did not text my husband, and in that moment, without noise or declaration, something irreversible began to shift. When I left my phone face down on the counter that night, my mind did not rush forward. It moved backward. Memory has its own gravity, and once silence clears the noise, the past rises with uncomfortable precision. People like to believe marriages break in one dramatic moment. Mine did not. It thinned over years of quiet decisions that looked reasonable at the time and irreversible in hindsight. I was 22 when I earned the scholarship, full tuition, a research track that carried my name. My mother cried when the letter arrived, not from pride alone, but from relief. She believed it meant our family would finally step into a future that was not defined by survival. Daniel was not a CEO then. He was a man with ambition, charm, and a desk drawer filled with sketches for a biotech company he insisted would matter. I believed him. I believed in us. We married quickly. The scholarship deadline arrived with the wedding invitations. Daniel did not ask me to give it up. He did something more subtle. He praised my intelligence, then asked for my help. He said it would only be for a year. He said we would revisit it once things stabilized. It sounded like a partnership. It sounded temporary. I told myself sacrifice was part of love. Then came the children. Time compressed into school schedules, doctor appointments, and the invisible labor that keeps a household moving without applause. I learned to organize my life around Daniel's moods and meetings. I learned to be efficient, calm, and supportive. I told myself I was choosing a family. I did not admit I was also choosing invisibility. From the outside, I was a devoted wife. From the inside, I was constructing the scaffolding that allowed Daniel to climb. I hosted dinners and curated conversations. I read contracts while stirring soup. I caught errors before they reached the board. I learned to smile when people thanked Daniel for things I had quietly prevented from failing. 10 years ago, Hale Biotech nearly collapsed. That part of the story rarely makes it into press profiles. Daniel had promised timelines that were impossible. An FDA delay triggered panic. Investors circled. A lawsuit loomed. Staff began preparing exits. Daniel came home one night, slammed a folder on the table, and stared at the floor like a man who had lost his reflection. I did not comfort him with words. I asked for the folder. I stayed awake for 2 nights, not out of heroism, but necessity. I mapped liabilities, flagged renegotiable contracts, and stripped away projects designed to impress rather than endure. I built a restructuring plan that protected the science and stabilized cash flow. I drafted a communication strategy that calmed investors without deception. I assembled everything into a clear, disciplined proposal. When Daniel woke, I handed him the binder. I told him what to say and when to say it. He looked at me with something close to awe, then took it to the office. The company survived. Then it grew. The narrative became one of Daniel's resilience and vision under pressure. I stood in the back of conference rooms, applauding politely as my contribution vanished into his legend. Richard Hale noticed. Daniel's father was not warm, but he was precise. After a board dinner, he found me alone in the study, clearing plates because I needed movement to think. He watched me quietly, then said, "You are the only one who can see the whole picture." He did not say it as praise. He said it as fact. In that moment, something settled painfully into place. Richard had always known my value. Daniel had always relied on it. And yet, my worth remained conditional, easy to threaten, easy to dismiss. That was the foundation I stood on when my husband later told me to apologize or lose everything. The injustice was not sudden. It was cumulative. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Sienna Brooks did not arrive like a villain. There was no sharp edge, no open hostility, no raised voice that would justify resistance. That was precisely why she was effective. She entered the company the way certain ideas do, softly, wrapped in language that made disagreement sound regressive. By the time most people noticed her influence, it already felt impolite to question it. She was introduced to the board as innovation lead, young, charismatic, educated at all the right institutions. She spoke fluently about disruption and equity, about modern leadership and emotional safety. When she smiled, people leaned forward. When she paused, the room waited. The first time I heard her speak, I felt something familiar tighten in my chest. Not jealousy, recognition. I knew that tone. I had used it myself years ago before I learned how easily language could be repurposed. She did not attack me directly. She did not need to. She framed her arguments in ways that made my presence feel outdated. When I asked about the process, she called it rigidity. When I asked about oversight, she called it mistrust. She never said my name, but everyone knew who she meant. "This company needs to move past fear-based leadership," she said once, looking around the table with practiced concern. "Innovation cannot thrive in a toxic workplace." The word landed heavily. Toxic. No one asked for clarification. No one questioned what behavior qualified. The label itself was enough. I noticed how she positioned herself, always aligned with women, always supportive in public. She praised my past contributions in vague terms, then gently suggested the future required different energy. She spoke about women supporting women, about dismantling old power dynamics, about making room for new voices. It was difficult to object without sounding defensive. The board listened to her. They nodded when she spoke. They repeated her phrases in later meetings, as if they were insights they had arrived at independently. Meanwhile, my questions began to sound inconvenient. My experience began to feel heavy. Daniel watched this shift with interest rather than alarm. He liked Sienna's confidence. He liked how easily she spoke to the press. He liked that she made the company look progressive without asking him to relinquish control. In meetings, he deferred to her, not because she was always right, but because she was useful. I tried, briefly, to engage her directly. I asked about metrics, about accountability, about legal exposure. She responded with warmth and reframed my concerns as emotional rather than structural. "I hear your anxiety," she said once, smiling gently, "but fear should not dictate innovation." It was a masterful move. By acknowledging emotion, she invalidated analysis. Soon, the pattern was established. When Sienna spoke, the room leaned in. When I spoke, the room shifted. People glanced at Daniel. Someone checked their phone. The contrast was not subtle. It was strategic. What unsettled me most was how convincing it all looked from the outside. If you believed her narrative, she was the future and I was the past. She was empowerment and I was resistant. She was making progress and I was cautious. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent decades navigating rooms dominated by men, learning how to speak without being dismissed. Now I was being sidelined by a woman using the language of inclusion to exclude. This was not feminism. It was branding. I could have challenged her publicly. I could have named the contradictions, exposed the gaps in her work, questioned her authority. But I understood something the board did not. Power does not need to announce itself to be effective. It only needs to redirect attention. By the time Daniel later told me to apologize to her, the decision had already been made elsewhere. The board had accepted a new narrative, one in which I was no longer essential. Watching it unfold, I realized this was not a personal conflict. It was a structural one. And once structure shifts, sentiment follows. That understanding changed how I prepared for what came next. It was Elaine Porter who finally broke the silence around me, not with urgency and not with fear, but with precision. She asked to see me late one afternoon, long after most offices on our floor had gone dark. Elaine was the head of internal legal, 51 years old, and widely considered difficult by people who preferred convenience over correctness. She had been widowed years earlier, though she never spoke of it unless asked. Grief had sharpened her, not softened her. Her office was orderly in a way that felt intentional. No personal photos, no inspirational quotes, just files aligned with care and a small lamp that cast a narrow pool of light across her desk. She did not offer me tea. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply gestured for me to sit. "I want to be clear," she said calmly. "I am not here to scare you." That alone told me she was about to say something important. Elaine did not speak in hypotheticals. She spoke in patterns. She explained what happens when power consolidates around one narrative, how dissent becomes framed as disloyalty, how process is recast as obstruction. She never mentioned Sienna by name, and she never criticized Daniel directly. She did not need to. "You are being repositioned," she said, not unkindly, quietly. I asked her if she thought it was intentional. She paused, choosing her words. "Intent is not the most relevant factor. Effect is." She slid a folder toward me. It contained nothing dramatic, no accusations, no evidence, just timelines, memos, policy revisions, small shifts that, taken alone, meant nothing. Taken together, they told a story I recognized too well. She looked at me then, truly looked, as if measuring how much truth I could hold without flinching. "I once believed silence was noble," she said. "I believed if I did my job well enough, the system would protect me." Her voice did not tremble. It did not need to. In reality, silence without strategy is just disappearing. That sentence settled into me with the weight of something earned. Not advice, no warning. A conclusion. Elaine did not tell me what to do. She respected me too much for that. She simply outlined options, all of them procedural, all of them legal, all of them quiet. She spoke about documentation, about timing, about the importance of understanding jurisdiction and exposure. She reminded me that information has value only when it is used deliberately. As she spoke, I realized something else. Elaine was not just advising me. She was showing me her own past, carefully, without asking for sympathy. She had once trusted the institution to see her worth. When it did not, she learned to survive by becoming precise. I asked her why she was helping me. She considered that for a moment. "Because you still have choices," she said, "and because I wish someone had spoken to me sooner." When I left her office, the building felt different, not hostile, transparent. I began to see the corridors not as neutral spaces, but as systems designed to favor momentum over reflection. Elaine had not lit a fire. She had handed me a map. That night, I did not confront Daniel. I did not demand explanations. I did not attempt to correct the narrative forming around me. Instead, I began to prepare. Preparation did not look dramatic. It looked like reading, like cross-referencing, like understanding where my name appeared and where it did not. It looked like restraint. Silence became my discipline. I stopped explaining myself in meetings. I started listening more closely. I noted who spoke after whom. I watched which concerns were acknowledged and which were reframed. I learned where decisions were actually made, not where they were announced. Elaine checked in once more, briefly, through a single-line email that said only, "Proceed carefully." I did. Because silence, when chosen, is not absence. It is positioning. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer waiting to be heard. I was getting ready to move. The board meeting took place 3 days before Christmas, scheduled deliberately close to the holiday when people are tired and eager to conclude. I recognized the timing immediately. Decisions made under fatigue rarely invite resistance. By the time I entered the room, most of the outcome had already been emotionally agreed upon, if not formally decided. I took my seat without greeting Daniel, not as a statement but as consistency. Silence, once adopted, must be maintained. Sienna was already presenting. Her slides were polished, visually elegant, and intentionally light on detail. She spoke about scalability, market disruption, and cultural alignment. She used phrases the board had grown comfortable repeating. Agile, future forward, inclusive innovation. Every word was designed to sound inevitable. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that signaled approval. I did not speak immediately. I waited until Daniel glanced at me, a look that was half challenge, half expectation. He believed he was being generous by allowing me the floor. I addressed the substance, not the style. I asked about regulatory exposure in overseas trials. I pointed out inconsistencies between projected timelines and approval realities. I referenced data that contradicted her optimism, not aggressively, but methodically. I did not mention Sienna's name more than necessary. The room shifted. Some board members frowned. Others leaned back. I recognized the signs. Analysis was interrupting momentum. Sienna responded calmly. She reframed my concerns as legacy thinking, as risk aversion shaped by older frameworks. She spoke about the need to trust new leadership and not let fear dictate strategy. I noticed how often she used the word fear. Daniel intervened before the discussion could deepen. He thanked me for my diligence, then redirected the conversation toward vision. He praised Sienna's courage and highlighted the importance of moving decisively. Then he did something deliberate. He announced a budget reallocation. The project I had been quietly protecting, a compliance-focused initiative designed to stabilize long-term exposure, would lose funding. The resources would be redirected to Sienna's program. The decision was framed as strategic alignment. I understood the message instantly. This was not about numbers. It was about hierarchy. Daniel was signaling to the board where authority now lived. I did not object. I could have cited precedents. I could have warned of consequences. I could have forced a vote that would expose fractures. Instead, I nodded once, acknowledging the decision without endorsing it. That restraint unsettled some people. It did not unsettle Daniel. He mistook it for defeat. The meeting ended with polite closure. People gathered their papers and wished each other pleasant holidays. Sienna avoided my gaze. Daniel did not. As we walked out, he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You see," he said quietly, "this did not have to be difficult." I did not respond. In the elevator, alone, I felt the familiar sensation of loss. Not because I had lost funding, but because I had witnessed something final. The board had chosen speed over stability, narrative over structure. That choice would not reveal its cost immediately. It never does. Back in my office, I sat without turning on the light. I replayed the meeting not with regret, but with precision. Every interruption, every deflection, every moment where analysis was labeled resistance. I had lost, temporarily. But I had also learned exactly how power was now being exercised. And knowledge, when paired with patience, has its own kind of leverage. The audience might have felt angry watching that meeting unfold. I understood why. It looked unfair. It was unfair. But injustice, when mapped carefully, becomes predictable. That afternoon, I did not appeal the decision. I documented it. And while Daniel celebrated a small victory, I quietly adjusted my understanding of the battlefield. Christmas Eve arrived without ceremony. The house was quiet in a way that felt staged, as if the decorations were performing cheer without conviction. The tree lights were on a timer, the candles were unlit. Daniel came home later than usual, his coat still carrying the cold of the outside world, his expression already organized for confrontation. He did not ask how my day had been. He did not comment on the dinner I had prepared. He moved through the kitchen as if it were a conference room, scanning surfaces, avoiding anything that might slow him down. I watched him the way one watches weather approach, not with fear, but with attention. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded and sat at the table. I did not pour wine. I did not reach for comfort. I placed my hands flat on the wood and waited. Daniel remained standing. That choice mattered. Standing establishes dominance. It keeps the other person contained. "I spoke with the board," he began. "They are concerned." Not angry. Concerned. Corporate language is designed to sound reasonable even when it threatens. "They feel there has been friction, he continued. "Unnecessary tension. That kind of environment is not aligned with our values." Our values. He had learned to pluralize authority. I asked him what he meant by friction. He exhaled, as if burdened by my question. "Your behavior towards Sienna has been perceived as undermining. It puts me in a difficult position." There it was, the shift from facts to perception. "I asked about compliance," I said calmly. Daniel waved his hand slightly. "Intent is irrelevant. Impact matters." He sat down across from me then, leaning forward. This was the part he believed was generous. "Sienna feels disrespected," he said, "and frankly, so do I." He explained the consequences carefully, as if outlining a performance review. If I apologized publicly, things could return to equilibrium. My paycheck would continue. The promotion Richard had approved could still move forward. If I did not, my role would be reassessed. Resources would be redirected. My visibility would be reduced. He did not say the word punished. He did not need to. "This is about alignment," he said, "about choosing the future." I looked at him, really looked, and noticed how practiced he had become at translating personal betrayal into corporate necessity. He believed this language made the decision neutral, professional. I realized then that he no longer saw me as a partner. He saw me as a variable. The room felt very still. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed distant. I became acutely aware of time slowing, stretching the moment thin. I considered the apology he wanted. It would cost me nothing. Immediately, a few sentences, a performance of humility. It would smooth the narrative and restore my position, at least temporarily. That option hovered in the air, easy and familiar, but another question rose beneath it, quiet and insistent. If I apologize, what exactly am I agreeing to become? Daniel waited. He was confident in his leverage. He believed the structure favored him, and at that moment it did. "I need your answer tonight," he said. "We cannot go into the holiday unresolved." I noticed how my body felt, not tense, not heavy, clear. I thought of the boardroom, of the budget cut, of Elaine's voice, of the cup with the crack that never broke because it had learned how to hold heat without shattering. I understood then that this was not a choice between peace and conflict. It was a choice between erasure and movement. I lifted my eyes to his and said the word he expected. Okay. It landed softly between us. No emphasis, no drama. Daniel relaxed almost immediately. His shoulders dropped, his mouth curved into something close to relief. He believed the conversation was over. He did not ask what I meant. He stood, satisfied, and reached for his coat. "Thank you," he said. "This is the right decision." I remained seated long after he left the room. That single word echoed, not loudly, but decisively. It marked a pivot so subtle it escaped notice, even from the man who thought he had won. He thought, "Okay," meant compliance. In truth, it meant I had chosen my exit. London greeted me without warmth. Not cold, exactly, but indifferent. The city did not care that I had crossed an ocean believing distance would translate into peace. It simply moved at its own pace, gray and efficient, as if reminding me that escape does not guarantee refuge. The apartment arranged by the company was clean, modern, and temporary in every visible way. Neutral furniture, white walls, nothing that suggested permanence. On my first morning, I stood by the window watching people walk past below, all of them clearly headed somewhere they understood. I realized I had mistaken motion for direction. The visa delay arrived 3 days later. It was framed as administrative, a backlog, nothing personal. I was advised to avoid external meetings until the matter cleared. Avoid exposure. Avoid visibility. The words sounded familiar. I recognized the pattern immediately. Containment disguised as caution. At the office, conversation stalled politely when I entered the room. People were courteous but careful. News travels faster than facts, and scandal leaves a residue even when unproven. I noticed how often my name was paired with qualifiers: temporary, pending, complicated. A partner from Frankfurt postponed our meeting. Another asked gently whether the timing was appropriate given recent developments in the U.S. No one accused me of anything directly. They did not have to. Suspicion works best when it appears reasonable. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt unsteady. I had believed London would give me space to breathe. Instead, it reflected my isolation back at me, larger and quieter. Without the familiar structure of home or the immediate tension of conflict, doubt found room to grow. I questioned my timing, my judgment, my resolve. One evening, after a call ended earlier than expected, I remained seated at the desk long after the office emptied. The lights dimmed automatically, leaving me in a narrow pool of brightness surrounded by glass and shadow. I felt the weight of what I had given up settle fully for the first time. What if I had miscalculated? What if distance had only delayed the same outcome? What if I had mistaken endurance for strength? I considered returning. Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly, with an apology shaped carefully enough to preserve some dignity. The thought brought a surprising sense of relief, like setting down something heavy. That frightened me, because relief born of surrender does not last. I walked back to the apartment through unfamiliar streets, the city humming around me. I noticed how many windows were lit, how many lives were unfolding beyond my reach. Reinvention, I realized, is not a single decision. It is a sequence of them, each more difficult than the last. That night, I unpacked the last box I had avoided since arriving. At the bottom was a notebook I had carried from home, its pages still blank. I opened it and read the first line I had written weeks earlier before everything unraveled: clarity before comfort. I closed the notebook and sat in silence, allowing myself to feel the fear fully. Not to indulge it, but to understand it. Fear, when acknowledged, loses its authority. The next morning, I received confirmation that the visa issue would take longer than expected. No timeline, just patience. I nodded to myself, alone in the kitchen. London was not a haven, it was a test. And for the first time since this began, I wavered. But wavering is not the same as retreat. It is simply the moment where resolve is forced to deepen. I poured myself tea using a plain mug borrowed from the apartment cupboard. It did not fit my hands the way the old one had. Nothing here did, yet. As I stood there watching the steam rise, I understood that doubt was not a sign of weakness. It was proof that the stakes were real. And that meant I was still moving forward, even when the path felt uncertain. 2 weeks after I arrived in London, the first call came in before dawn. The U.S. number on my screen felt like a hand closing around my wrist. I answered quietly, already expecting Daniel's voice. Instead, it was a compliance officer I barely knew, speaking with the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script. He informed me that an internal investigation had been opened, a formal review. Allegations had been submitted regarding leadership conduct, workplace retaliation, and misuse of authority. He did not say Daniel's name at first. He did not have to. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Sienna Brooks had initiated the report. The words landed with a strange clarity. Of course she did. She had built her power inside Daniel's shadow, and the moment that shadow began to look dangerous, she stepped out of it. Sienna was not loyal. She was adaptive. She was the kind of antagonist who survives by changing shape. And for a brief moment, I almost respected the instinct. Almost. By mid-morning, emails began circulating through the European office in softened language. Ongoing review, temporary adjustments, standard procedure. But partners were not interested in the procedure. They were interested in risk. The same people who had postponed meetings now questioned whether I was associated with the allegations, whether I had knowledge of misconduct, whether my presence in London was connected to a strategic exit from scandal. It happened quickly, the way reputations bleed. A rumor does not need proof. It only needs timing. Then the second call came, this time from outside counsel retained by the board, and the tone sharpened. I was asked to make myself available for interviews. I was told not to discuss the matter with anyone internally. I was informed that my previous role, my marriage, and my communications could become relevant. I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the blank wall, feeling the weight of being pulled back into a war I had tried to leave behind. This was the danger of quiet exits. The past can still reach you, even when you move continents. I opened my laptop and reviewed what I had, not rumors, not impressions, evidence, documents, meeting notes, internal policy changes, timelines Elaine had helped me notice, and the threads that tied Daniel's decisions to Sienna's ascent. I had not taken anything illegally. I had not stolen files or forwarded confidential materials recklessly. What I held was a map of behavior, a pattern of retaliation disguised as alignment, and proof that the board had been nudged toward choices that protected Daniel's image at the expense of the company's integrity. If I sent it, the investigation would tilt immediately. Daniel would be cornered. Sienna would be exposed. I would be vindicated. The outcome would be swift. I stared at the cursor in the email draft window. One attachment, one click, one clean release of pressure. Then the question rose inside me, sharp enough to feel physical. If I speak, I win right away. But do I become them? It was not a sentimental question. It was a structural one. Daniel used power to punish. Sienna used narrative to protect herself. If I used evidence to destroy them, even in the name of justice, what would that make me? Another person who weaponized information to control the story. Another person who treated truth as a tool rather than a responsibility. Elaine's sentence returned to me with precision. Silence without. Strategy is just disappearing. But strategy without conscience becomes cruelty dressed as competence. I thought of Richard Hale, of the way he had spoken to me years ago, not with affection, but with recognition. You are the only one who can see the whole picture. That had been both a compliment and a burden. Seeing the whole picture meant acknowledging that the company was more than Daniel. It meant the employees, the trials, the patients, the science, the partners who depended on stability. If I detonated everything, I might satisfy a personal need for justice while causing collateral damage that would fall on people who had never sat at our dinner table. So I did the hardest thing I had done in months. I did nothing. I did not send the evidence. Not yet. I answered the investigator's questions truthfully, carefully, without volunteering what I did not need to volunteer. I let the process move at its natural pace, even when it frustrated me. I let Daniel face the consequences of the story he had built, without handing him the excuse of calling me vindictive. I let Sienna's accusations stand on their own, knowing that a person who reports to save herself often leaves fingerprints in the details. That night, as rain tapped lightly against the window, my phone buzzed again. A short message from Elaine. No greeting, no comfort, just 3 words. Hold steady, watch. I set the phone down and exhaled slowly, because for the first time I understood the shape of what was coming. The collapse would not be loud, it would be procedural, and in the silence between steps, I would have to decide exactly who I was willing to be. The news did not arrive as a headline. There was no dramatic announcement, no emergency call, no late-night confession. It came the way institutional consequences always do, folded into neutral language and released at a time designed to minimize reaction. A routine update, a transition notice, an adjustment in leadership. Daniel Hale would be stepping down. The message reached me through a forwarded email from London Compliance, stripped of emotion, dense with phrasing that avoided blame while acknowledging necessity. The board had accepted his resignation effective immediately. An interim CEO would be appointed. Operations would continue uninterrupted. Hale Biotech remained committed to its values. Values again. I read the message twice, not to confirm it was real, but to observe my own response. There was no surge of satisfaction, no vindictive relief. What I felt instead was a quiet narrowing, as if something loose inside me had finally settled into place. Later that day, I learned that Sienna Brooks was no longer with the company. Her name vanished from internal directories. Her projects were paused pending review. No farewell email circulated. No explanation followed. She did not fight publicly. She did not attempt to reframe the narrative one last time. She disappeared the way people do when the story they built can no longer protect them. It was efficient, almost elegant. Daniel did not call me. I imagined him in his office for the last time, clearing out drawers, packing awards and framed magazine covers, confronting the reality that the language he had used to control others could not save him from procedure. I did not take pleasure in the image. I did not avoid it either. Some truths do not require commentary. What struck me most was how little noise accompanied the collapse. No shouting, no courtroom spectacle, no public reckoning. The system corrected itself the way systems often do, slowly and impersonally, absorbing individual failures into process. I had not sent the evidence. The investigation had uncovered enough on its own. Patterns revealed themselves when pressure was applied consistently. Decisions Daniel had made to protect image over integrity accumulated into something undeniable. Sienna's report, designed to shield herself, had widened the lens rather than narrowing it. Her accusations pulled threads she could not control. I watched from a distance, deliberately removed, allowing the consequences to unfold without my hand on the scale. This was not mercy. It was restraint. In the days that followed, people reached out cautiously. Former colleagues sent brief messages expressing surprise, concern, sympathy. Some asked if I was all right. Others avoided the topic entirely, unsure how to place me now that my role in the story was ambiguous. I responded politely and sparingly. I did not clarify. I did not claim vindication. Revenge suggests intent. This felt different. What unfolded was not punishment delivered by me, but consequence delivered by structure. Daniel had built his authority on narrative control. Once that control fractured, the weight of his decisions became visible. The system he trusted to amplify him also limited him. At night, in the London apartment, I sat quietly and allowed myself to process the shift, not with celebration, but with assessment. I thought of Elaine, of her map, of the discipline it had taken not to intervene when intervention would have benefited me personally. I thought of the moral line I had refused to cross, not because I was virtuous, but because I needed to live with the outcome. Power, I realized, reveals character not when it is gained, but when it is lost. I did not attend any meetings about Daniel's departure. I was not consulted on succession. That, too, was intentional. I did not want proximity to the fall. Distance was not avoidable. It was closed. One evening, as the city settled into its usual rhythm, I poured myself tea and stood by the window, watching the reflection of streetlights on wet pavement. The world outside continued, indifferent to individual downfalls. That was oddly comforting. This was not victory in the way stories often promise. There was no moment of triumph to mark, no speech to deliver. What remained was quieter and heavier. Justice, when it arrives without spectacle, leaves room for reflection, and in that silence, I understood something essential. I had not destroyed anyone. I had simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of who they chose to be. Richard Hale contacted me through his attorney, not Daniel's attorney and not the board's, his own. The message was brief and formal, requesting my presence in New York for a private matter. There was no mention of Daniel, no mention of the investigation, only a date, a time, and an address I recognized immediately. Richard's office overlooked the river, far from the company's headquarters, far from spectacle. He looked smaller when I entered the room. Age had finally claimed some of the authority time had once amplified, but his eyes were still sharp, still measuring. "I am glad you came," he said, motioning for me to sit. He did not ask about London. He did not ask about Daniel. He opened a folder instead, thick with documents prepared long before any of this unfolded. "I have amended my will," he said, "and my trust." He slid the papers toward me. I did not touch them at first. I read his face instead, searching for a motive. Richard had never been sentimental. Everything he did served a structure. "You will receive my voting shares," he continued, "effective immediately." The words landed slowly, not because I did not understand them, but because I understood them too well. Those shares carried influence, control, the ability to reshape the company's future. And, he added after a pause, "the board would like you to consider stepping into the role of CEO." There it was, the culmination of everything I had been denied and everything I had built without recognition. The offer was not framed as an apology. It was framed as a correction. Richard studied me carefully. "You see what others do not," he said. "You always have." I felt the weight of the room press in around me. This was power, offered cleanly, without drama, without conditions spoken aloud. It was the kind of power many people spend their lives chasing, and it was being placed in my hands because I had refused to misuse it earlier. I asked him why now. "Because the company needs stability, Sinas," he replied, "and because I will not live forever." He was honest. That mattered. I finally picked up the papers and scanned them, not for legality, but for intention. Everything was in order. Elaine had already ensured that. Richard had prepared this quietly, methodically, long before Daniel's fall forced his hand. I imagined myself accepting, returning to the center of influence, sitting in the chair Daniel had vacated, restoring what had been damaged, proving, publicly and permanently, that I had been right all along. The image was powerful and exhausting. With the offer came responsibility, not just to the company, but to the story that would follow. The headlines would frame it as redemption, or revenge, or inheritance. No matter how carefully I spoke, the narrative would not be mine to control. I thought of London, of the space I had carved out there, fragile but honest. I thought of the cost it had taken to step away and the clarity that distance had given me. "This would change everything," I said. "Yes," Richard replied. "That is the point." I looked at him then and understood that this was the final test, not of competence, but of desire. Power is only a gift if you still want what it demands. I asked for time. He nodded once. "Choose carefully, Pshan," he said. "This is not an offer that can be repeated." As I left the office, the papers untouched on the table behind me, I felt the gravity of the choice settle fully. Accepting would validate every sacrifice I had made. Declining would mean walking away from the ultimate proof of worth. Both paths carried loss, and for the first time since this began, I knew the hardest decision was still ahead. I did not decide immediately. I returned to London with the offer folded neatly into my bag, untouched, as if proximity alone might reveal its answer. For several days, I moved through my routines without forcing a conclusion. I went to the office. I answered emails. I walked the same streets each evening, letting the city remain itself while I examined who I had become inside it. Power waits patiently. It does not rush you. It allows you to imagine yourself deserving it. In quieter moments, I replayed Richard's words. "You see what others do not." He was right. That was precisely why the offer felt so heavy. Seeing the whole picture means understanding not only what you can take, but what it will take from you. London had not welcomed me easily. It tested me. It had exposed my doubt and stripped away the identity I had relied on for years. And yet, in that stripping, something essential had been returned to me. I woke each morning knowing my choices were mine alone. No board, no marriage, no performance. One evening, I stood in my small kitchen holding the phone, Richard's number already pulled up. I practiced the conversation silently, rehearsing gratitude, justification, logic. None of it felt honest, so I did not use it. Instead, I called Elaine. "I think I know my answer," I said. She did not ask what it was. She simply said, "Then you are already ahead of where most people stop." The next morning, I booked a flight back to New York, not to negotiate, but to conclude. Richard listened without interruption as I spoke. I thanked him for the trust. I acknowledged the weight of the offer. I did not apologize for my decision. "I am not coming back," I said calmly, "not to prove anything, not to correct the record." He studied me, not displeased, not surprised. Perhaps he had expected this all along. "You are walking away from control," he said. "I am choosing alignment," I replied. Then I said the sentence I had been carrying with me for days, the one that finally clarified everything. "I do not need to return to prove that I was right." The words did not tremble. They did not ask for validation. They simply existed. Richard nodded slowly. "That may be the clearest leadership decision you have ever made." I left the office lighter than I had entered it, not because I had rejected power, but because I had refused to let power define me. There is a difference, and it is one most people never learn to name. Back in London, the city felt different, not kinder, but familiar. I rearranged the apartment furniture slightly, not for aesthetics, but for comfort. I bought a proper mug, one that fit my hands. Small decisions, but intentional ones. Work continued. Slowly, credibility rebuilt itself, not through titles, but through consistency. The scandal faded into background noise. New partnerships formed. My visa was approved without ceremony. Stability returned, not because I demanded it, but because I stayed. Empowerment, I realized, is not seizing the throne when it is offered. It is knowing when the throne no longer matters. That night, I wrote one sentence in my notebook, beneath the line I had read during my lowest moment. Clarity before comfort. This time, I understood exactly what it meant. I did not need to go back to be whole. I did not need to win publicly to be at peace. I did not need power to be free. London was not an escape. It was a choice. And for the first time in my life, it was entirely mine. The first time I made tea in my London office, I did it without thinking. Habit has a way of returning when life finally becomes steady enough to hold it. It was early before the rest of the floor filled with footsteps and voices. The sky outside the window was a soft gray, the kind London wears like a neutral coat. Inside, the space smelled faintly of paper and clean wood, new enough to still feel unfamiliar, but no longer temporary. I set the kettle on the small counter near the window and waited. The quiet did not feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. When the water warmed, I reached into the cabinet and took out the cup I had bought a few weeks earlier. It was porcelain, simple, pale, with a smooth curve that fit my hands the way my old cracked cup once did, but without the damage. No thin fracture running along the side. No hairline reminder of what it had survived, just clean, intact ceramic. For a moment, I held it still and noticed how my fingers rested differently, as if my body was learning that it did not have to brace for breakage. I poured the water and watched the steam rise. The motion was ordinary, but the meaning felt new. For years, my mornings had been shaped by other people's demands. Even my quiet rituals had existed inside someone else's schedule. Here, in this office, this morning, the tea belonged only to me. The phone on my desk lit up briefly with notifications, a meeting confirmation, a partner replied, a reminder about an upcoming review, normal life, the kind that arrives when drama has exhausted itself and the world continues. I sat down and opened my notebook. The pages had filled slowly over the past months, not with revenge plans or speeches, but with observations, patterns, small truths I did not want to forget. I had written down what silence can be when it is chosen, how restraint can become strength, how leaving can be an act of dignity rather than defeat. I thought of Daniel, not with longing and not with hatred, just with distance. He had wanted obedience disguised as reconciliation. He had believed my value depended on my willingness to stay small. His collapse had been quiet, not because he deserved kindness, but because consequence often does not need an audience. I thought of Sienna, too. She had used the language of empowerment to protect herself, and she had learned too late that narratives can turn. I did not celebrate her disappearance. I simply accepted it as part of the same system that had once tried to erase me. And I thought of Richard. His offer had been real. So had the power inside it. But my refusal had been real too. I had walked away from the ultimate proof of competence because I finally understood I did not need proof. I needed peace. Outside my office window, the city moved forward. Buses passed. People crossed the street with umbrellas tucked under their arms. The world did not pause to admire my choices. That was the point. Healing is not a spotlight moment. It is a return to yourself. I lifted the cup and took a slow sip. The tea was hot, clean, and uncomplicated. The cup held it without strain. Then quietly I said the words that had followed me from the beginning, not as a victory line, but as a truth I could finally live inside. That day I said, okay, not to stay, but to walk away. I set the cup down and looked around the office again. It was not a throne. It was not a battlefield. It was simply a room where my work mattered, where my voice did not need permission, where my life did not revolve around someone else's image. If you have ever been overlooked after sacrificing your whole life, leave a comment. You are not alone.